So I think we can check the chat, and I'm just looking. We have one comment. Yes, so there's a comment about with AI as an investment, not only is there an initial cost, but there's ongoing cost as well. It's a really good comment from Stan. Yes, this is something that companies would need to determine. Does the return on investment for AI outweigh the initial cost? This is something I really would recommend that organizations check into this and see how their users would plan to use the tool, who would be using it. Does it gain them some efficiencies? Can you do more work with the same team? Can you do the same amount of work with a smaller team? Whatever it is that's the concern, that information should be checked and weighed against the operating costs of having AI.
I can jump in here. I just typed up this question, but I'm curious what the group's perspective is here. Um, where would this group draw a line between where they would expect AI to provide an answer to something they're trying to do, where they would want it to give its best guess, and where they want it to just completely stay away to try and balance domain expertise and AI support? I'm curious, Sarah, if you have an initial thought on that.
Without saying anything too proprietary, my feel on this is that organizations would need to supplement whatever's out there open source for AI with some of their detailed information. And that detailed information would need to be kept proprietary. AI is not going to intimately know whatever system is being designed without somehow being told what that system is. So I think there's got to be a balance between, using these large language models that are open source maybe, plus teaching the AI what your system is to some extent, but keeping that information private. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, it does. The thought process here is with or without proprietary information. I think that's a good line to draw to clarify that you can probably trust answers more if you have more proprietary information as part of the process. Are there certain things that you would expect an AI tool to be able to just answer? And that may be different in those two different worlds. Are there some that you would want it to give a best guess to say, you need to fix this? Here's what you might want to do. Are there some areas, and this may be the most clear-cut one, where you say, I don't even want the AI to try and do this?
It's a really good question. I'd be interested to see what other users think because for me, the answer again, it really depends on how well does the AI know your system, whatever it is. If it really knows it, if you're really confident that you've got the AI totally aligned with what your system is, maybe you could trust the data a little bit more. But there might be cases where that's just not possible. So I'm going to scroll down and see if anyone has provided some comments on that in the chat. But anyone who wants to respond to Dan's comment, please feel free.
I had a thought, and I don't know if some of the AI tools do this or not. I would say from the, best guess kind of thing. So any of the AI apps or what have you that help with things like, the guide to writing requirements where you have a list of rules and it's identifying that, hey, you violated one of these rules. You could, make this requirement better if you add this or that. That's, probably a good guess. Where, some of the stay away from is maybe some new development, product activity, or, a highly secure classified information, that you won't be able to find, or you shouldn't be able to find much data on. So it kind of stays away from that. But the question that I pose is, as a follow-up to your question, I guess, and I don't know the details of all the AI tools, but do any of them provide a percent confidence on their own that they answered your question and can kind of use that as a threshold, like, anything above 85%, is a good guess, and anything below 60%, I'm going to stay away from kind of thing.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure if many do that, and if they do, how they do that, given the hallucinatory nature of a lot of AI out there.
If we're talking about large language models, they can't do that without a RAG or some base of knowledge that is managed by the enterprise that stages the AI models. Because the tool itself is just going to repeat what it's seen. It's not going to tell you what its confidence level is unless you give it a model that it can follow for that.
So then with those really interesting answers, I mean, how important is it for users that the AI is providing you like references to why it gave you this answer? How important is it for users to go check those references, or do we not need that information?
I think it's totally important. If you've used ChatGPT or Gemini, you go to the references. Really, it's the assistant model is take what it said and then look at the references because The references may tell you it's completely off track and you need to prompt it into a different direction. That's my take on it.
I was going to say the same thing. I think it's very important, and not only you're checking that, but also the currency of the information. How current is it? Is it pulling up a NCOC system engineering handbook from the early '90s or the latest version?
I also think that a couple of things that could be added here is AI prompting, just because AI prompts that are designed to limit not just the output, but also refine that search. And that's not the only thing I have to do. I agree with everyone that has been responding. One thing that you could also do besides the AI prompts and designing them better, or improving the output of your response, is being able to refine that LLM. If you do have an LLM, if you don't have an LLM, then they're right. They'll have to go back into ChatGPT or Gemini or whatever the case may be and look at that source code and say, okay, where's it pulling that information from? So that's just another input.
If we have to check it, right? So what is the added value? It saves us time on the one hand side, but we will have to check the answers that we get from AI for sources, so it will give us more work in the end.
Yeah, I
What's up?
think
Good
one of the
question.
limitations in AI is that the AI itself doesn't understand its own limitations. So it will take the best guess with whatever data it's been trained on. But, people have mentioned the hallucination part. When it gets to the border of what it really knows and what it is really well trained on, then you get some strange results. And I'm going back to one of the early slides, thinking of this as a tool to say, help me find duplicate requirements and all of that. I think it may be helpful to provide some examples that it was able to identify. But in terms of thinking of it as a tool like a calculator, calculators don't make mistakes. You can put bad data in and get a bad result, but what the calculator does is well defined. That's not the case for AI. And when you go through these use cases here, you have to ask yourself, what's the impact of an erroneous result or an omission, a failure to identify something? Did it really save time? If it's really critical that you get an accurate answer about similarities and duplicates and all of that, then the AI may have some suggestions for what to look at, but you're still obligated to go back and essentially do your due diligence. That's not clear to me in that context how much time the AI is really going to save.
That's a really good example. And I did like your point about the calculator. You're right. I can't think of a great analogy for what AI is like, other than, like we've said, digital assistant. It could be wrong. It could create more work for you if it does a bad job. But we need to find a balance of what could it do that we trust enough that it helped versus trying to have it do everything, but we can't trust the results, so we have to check the work every time.
The analogy I've really liked for AI is a really smart intern. They know a lot of stuff that's really useful, but they may not understand your organization well enough to know how best to apply it. And so you can delegate tasks, but you also need to check their work.
I like that. It's a good one.
If we can go to the next question, comment in the chat.
Yes, I'm trying to see which one we're on. Question. I think this one about some users have found AI is lazy. So if you feed like GPT a list of requirements, the quality of the feedback and the analysis goes down. So keeping less than 10 requirements seems best. That's interesting. So maybe it's also about us having to learn the capabilities of the AI and find that sweet spot where it's adding value, but it's not like it has to make life more efficient and better for us for it to be worth it, right? So there must be some sweet spot where it's adding value, it's not taking up too much extra effort from us, and it's saving us time on something else.
Based on those use cases, can we identify some that the AI would be very helpful and will not cause us any additional work?
Like use cases where AI could kind of be trusted and used as is without too much.
Yes, where it could be really helpful.
I think this first one is definitely a potential because the return is great and the risk is low. So if it's just importing a document, hopefully it's not doing anything with the content that it shouldn't be, like changing it. But if it's just maybe formatting a document and getting it into a requirements management tool, I see that as a pretty safe opportunity to use AI.
Sarah, there is a very good comment from Michael in the chat that it is good in data analysis and visualization. Do you have any experience, Michael, with that?
Yeah, so we've used it a lot to help us. You've got a whole bunch of test data, automotive industry, so some sort of vehicle data you're trying to compile trends across big things, or hey, can you give me like 5 different ways to look at this? And based on what other people have used for visualization, give you some ways to visualize that you haven't used. It's also really, really good for us as far as like I have some document in some legacy format, whether it's like Excel or a Word document or whatever, and I want to reformat into some different format to import into some other tool. You can have a lot of people that don't understand like scripting, but can get requirements from one place to another without having to go to like an IT team or find someone with the knowledge. I really like the smart intern analogy. I think that's pretty much how we use it, and it does a good job at that.
Nice. I'm going to go back up just a little bit because I want to make sure we've gotten through everybody's questions. Any thoughts on the best way to go deeper dive on integration with the enterprise's data protection scheme, even if theirs is immature? I'm going to open that one up to the team, see if anyone has thoughts.
It's my questions. I thought I'd clarify since we got silence on that. So I work in security, and the issue for us is if the enterprise doesn't have metadata management and systematic vetted tagging and labeling, and I don't like that word, I prefer metadata, but then the inference models are trained on unstable content. So the encryption practices, the onboarding of new data sets, the management of database schemas, the preferred use of anonymized or synthetic data for some use cases, all of that needs to be integrated with the deployment of LLMs, and teams have to work together in larger companies that normally don't. And that's why I think it's one of the issues.
Okay.
Just an initial thought there, listening to you talk about this. I think there's a difference to be called out for training versus leveraging information. If you train a model across boundaries, then there's certainly a risk of IP getting included in what's generated from that trained model. And so you do need to be careful how things are trained if you want to make sure that you are able to securely segment what goes where. That said, you could train something on what is more acceptable to cross boundaries and then leverage references through something like retrieval augmented generation to what you are allowed to see and use that as part of the prompting structure to better analyze and use that data. And so things like that could manage different approaches to what can train a model that everyone can use, what is only available to this particular user. And post-processing can help with that as well. If you're doing things like duplicate and similarity detection, you could look at a space where you find all of these things that are similar, analyze permissions of the user you're actually responding to, and only give them the things they're allowed to see. So there's kind of a nuanced answer there, but there's a lot of different pieces that go into that discussion.
Yeah, so it sounds like you've wrestled with this a bit. So how do you get the teams that are managing access right now to collaborate with that? Because I think the temptation is to use the model to ingest and help report on things like policy documents or project content for big projects. It can ingest everything from bills of materials to user manuals to email correspondence on project-related stuff. So the boundaries for where you have PII and also data that can be inferred using the tool that breaks privacy laws is not so easy. And that team probably is not on the AI team.
Yeah, it's a hard question to answer. I haven't implemented. I'm more on the building side for how these tools can be built. What I can say is you need to, one, understand the tool you're using and what its limitations and affordances are, and two, create an effective rollout and enablement approach in your organization to make sure people understand if they use certain data, what is the implication of doing that? Is it training a model? Is it not training a model? Is that going to be available to others? If so, how do you control that? It's going to be different for every tool you use and every way you use that tool. So it is important to really understand those details to manage that security.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay. I'm going to go down a little bit to Maria's question. So when you use AI tools, there's always noise associated with the output. So for this reason, it is important to have someone on the team to apply denoising techniques to help remove the bias. So basically, someone has to be kind of continuously tuning the AI to make sure it's giving good results, keeping in line kind of thing. Is that what you mean, Maria?
Yes, absolutely. That's what I mean. And so you need to have somebody who's either an AI engineer, or they don't have to specifically be an AI engineer, but maybe even an SE person that has trained on AI tools that, or at least know how to fine tune the model or the data. Yes, that's exactly what I mean.
That's a good point. Okay, so comment from Andrew. So prefer to stay away from the uncertainty piece. Hallucinations are risky, so using tools to evaluate is more useful. Andrew, in your question here, are you saying you'd be more comfortable using AI to evaluate existing content rather than to create content?
Yeah, that's right. And I think I was responding to an earlier ask for comments. It wasn't really a question.
Okay. Yep, this is a good comment. I think it's easier to use AI as a tool to see what's wrong with what you've already done rather than maybe to trust it to create something new. I think when it creates something new, my perspective is there's more work on the user to vet it. The question then is it more or less work than if the user created it from scratch? So I think that's that sweet spot again. Okay. Next comment.
Yeah, there's the work piece and the knowledge piece too. And I think you've talked about
Yes.
that quite a bit.
Yes, I agree. Okay, next comment from Luis. So any experiences or examples on how AI could be used to generate product or system requirements given certain regulatory requirements and a baseline architecture and boundaries condition? Really great question. I'm going to leave that up to open discussion.
Well, I'm going to throw a use case out there that's being discussed, hasn't been done yet, but this sort of reverse engineering a NIST project called OSCAL, which is intended to do compliance assurance for regulated industries, especially finance. So reverse engineered version of that, instead of looking at the tools, generates the compliance guidelines, pushes it back in the other direction instead of just doing the assessment early stages for that. But that's how it would work, sort of reverse reg ops.
Yeah, my thought was more like, since the regulations are normally kind of stable and you have, let's say, a roadmap of products, maybe you could use AI to translate those regulations into kind of an architecture and some product requirements, so then you don't have to redo it every time. So that was my train of thought.
Yeah, I think that's a feasible thing, but it's early days for that.
But letting AI help to see the connections between things, because like the V cycle, I do think it's challenging for individuals, even systems engineers, to have a perfect overview of the V cycle. So we know there's going to be customer regulatory requirements, and we're going to have system requirements and an architecture and lower level requirements. We know all of that, but keeping in mind anytime something changes, what's the impact or what's related to each other. It's hard to kind of see the big picture from the details. Like we can see the details from the work we've done in systems engineering, but how do you then infer the big picture result from those details? It can be challenging.
I think it comes back to the use case you brought up, Sarah, around traceability analysis. The better an AI tool can understand the relationship between all the pieces and make sure they're connected right, the better it can start to do things like identify where something maybe should be applied to a regulatory standard and how well is it actually complying with it, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thanks.
We'll go to the next one. So question for Mark. So worked with IEEE 15288. Do you see having these and other standards worked into an AI model? This is really interesting. You know, the idea of can industry or discipline specific, in this case, it's like discipline specific for systems engineering, but to work these into AI models, it's really interesting actually, because it's not about the product development. It's about the process to be followed maybe for the product development. So in that case, I wonder what an AI would do with something like this standard. I don't want it writing requirements for my system necessarily based on this standard, but I want it understanding that this is the process I would follow to write requirements for my system. And did I do it well? Did I actually follow that process? Because that's something challenging too. Like for process compliance and standards like that, you know, that's on the users to make sure that they prove compliance. Could an AI do it? Maybe. But I think it's also, could the AI get confused and think that somehow those process requirements are part of your system design. Could it get confused about that? Maybe. It would be interesting to see how it could handle something more on the process side versus the product development side.
I would think that that would come down to the type of data being used to be analyzed. If it's analyzing the system against system type requirements, things like in COSI standards, it would be good at doing that. And if you take the approach to back that off and say, I'm not looking at the quality of the requirement itself, or even the details in this requirement, I'm looking at the metadata of the requirement, how they're related to one another. If the right pieces are here, maybe considering the content of the requirement as part of that process, it would be much better at looking at process level compliance rather than system level compliance.
Right. Like I would see something, just a super simple example. Like I have a system requirement, but I've never tested it and there's no linked test anywhere. Could an AI trained on something like 15288 say, this is a gap in your process development? You should have some kind of test for this. Maybe. I don't know if that capability is something we see available today.
Yeah, so I'm working on a standard in IEEE for metadata, and there's a maturity model in it. And one of the things the LLMs can do is iterate through long lists. And if you can get the crosswalk to line up with the requirements in the standard, then it is possible to line that up with, implementation or, test suites and that sort of thing. It's messy, requires some kind of niggly nuisance stuff in creating the documents, but it's really quite good at that. And I think it definitely could find gaps of the sort that you mentioned. It's a lot harder with things like the quality standard, or like I think I saw you said something about 262 as well. And it gets harder for that. And also on the sustainability end of things, where we have some new standards, we're trying to wrestle with AI and sustainability. Uniform metrics for that make it really hard to line up propositions in the standard against propositions in the project documents or the product documents. So people have to do the crosswalk, but once any crosswalk is in place, it gives you some working content. A lot of it may be wrong, but it can move rather quickly, a lot faster than you could do by hand without the tool.
That's really interesting. Next question from Alex. So is QV Scribe as a plugin for Word and Excel a valuable tool to spend time experimenting with for requirements analysis and improvement? I'm going to open this up because I don't have any experience with this.
We used it and it is quite interesting tool to look into because it does lots of analysis, syntax analysis, and it people like it a lot because they see immediately what they wrote and it is analyzed and they can immediately update and improve their own requirements. So from that perspective, I think it's very good addition to the tool suite.
Okay, good feedback. Anyone else have comments on that one? Okay, we'll keep going. Next comment about guidelines for human in the loop. Okay, so this is a document that we could maybe go take a look at later. Thank you for sharing that, Mark. That looks really useful.
Sure.
Yes, more analogies. Yeah, I think so far I'm on the smart intern analogy too. I really like that one. So next comment, if the requirements are developed for a generic and straightforward project or system, using Gen AI can be beneficial. Otherwise, with complex and critical systems, it would be a better approach to build a specialized Gen AI tool that is trained on similar projects, or at least prompt in a systematic method that can be useful. I think this goes back to our earlier point, yes, on how well can the AI really know your system or my system. I think what's out there publicly available is insufficient to do that. So it'd be a question of, tuning or tailoring AI based on your system information. And, how could that be done in a way that's effective? I guess maybe a follow-up question. Are more users looking for kind of commercially available AI solutions, or are more users looking at my company would build our own AI solution? And again, don't go into any details about it, but is this something organizations are investing in their own AI development or looking for commercial solutions to AI for requirements engineering?
This is Mark. Small sample size here, but that was seen as beyond the scheme of a 20,000 employee company to do on their own. No talent to build a system, so they're going to use a commercially available system, one of the big two or three.
Okay, good feedback. Anybody else?
Sarah, you brought up on the slide, I think, a really good point about domain-specific aspects of this. I think that's a deeper dive content subject as well for figuring out where this get used, because the use cases for leveraging anything that touches natural language and in cozy practices, I think, is wide open and touches everything. But when you go to domain specific, now there's knowledge graphs and very particular kinds of technologies that can be applied that now could work closely with existing tools in a more specific way. And it leads us in different directions here. I don't know what would end up being most beneficial, but I think that's a really key observation you made there.
Yeah, and kind of related to this current question we're looking at, my gut feeling is that companies or organizations or whoever has the need for AI, you'd probably not have the knowledge to make your own tool, but you'd want to have a tool that you could customize with your own data. So a tool maybe that offers certain functionality, but you can load some domain specific knowledge, again, in a safe way that protects company proprietary information, so that the tool is now more applicable for your area and has more data that's relevant to you. But in terms of how that all works, I think it's a really interesting area. The difference between having something commercially available versus having something that's almost like another engineer in your project who really knows everything about your system. There's a huge gap.
Sarah, this is Lou. So part of this to me is a training issue. So wouldn't it be possible to maybe get a generic commercial, but it allows me to do proprietary training that's kept in-house, on my particular domain specific stuff, so I can get the best of both worlds? I don't know if that exists.
It's a really interesting area. Clearly, from these comments, there's a need to balance what's available out there that can be based off of large language models with a ton of data, but it's not related to your system, versus having a really detailed and domain specific knowledge. Finding a central place that meets that's useful would be very interesting to see.
And I believe they exist. We're exploring with one that looks internal first for responses and then goes outside. But we're struggling with kind of what we brought up earlier on the, what to use. It's knowing where that data came from. Did it come from in-house or did it come from outside to know how relevant we think it is? And then, to kind of answer the question that's been thrown out is, I like the idea of the out of the box experience. So any of these tool vendors that, if we're going to use Jama or Doors or Cameo, whatever, for requirements engineering, that they implement something like the guide to writing requirement rules. So that kind of comes out of the box. So I can use that from an AI perspective. And my rationale from my company is we're multi-industry. So it's kind of like Sarah said. We do make parts for cell phones and we make parts for airplanes. And I don't want to go searching it'd be an internal database, but I don't want responses that tells me, how a good sensor on a cell phone is when I'm building an aircraft. So even within our company, our data set gets kind of smaller and smaller. So, we're looking for that. Where can I get at a global level that helps us all? But then I've got to have unique, specific improvements also.
Yeah, really good point. Going down here about, so the use cases, so having balance is knowing when to move from a general tool like public to one with internal content added to a self-hosted on-premises. And yeah, like this is really hard. I think in a perfect world, everyone would have an AI completely tailored to your system that understands everything. That's literally like having a high-level systems engineer to do the work. Is that technically feasible or cost feasible? Probably not. So how do we decide which of these strategies is that right place? And I definitely encourage teams to look at some cost analysis and just see, like, what are the areas where your teams are not able to be efficient right now related to requirements engineering, and then compare that against what AI capabilities are out there that can improve efficiency in those areas and that also hopefully have low risk. Because if you're improving efficiency in something but introducing quality issues, that's not good. So I think it's not a one size fits all answer, and teams would have to go through and see what are their pain points, what are the areas they feel they could safely use digital assistance help from an AI, and does it actually save their engineers time and achieve the right level of quality that they need? Interesting question on most difficult use case. Dan has a response about decomposition or conflict detection? I'll provide my answer. I think anytime the AI has to create something on its own, that's the challenge. That's the hardest thing. So whether it's decomposition or whether you say, write me a really good requirement about this thing, that's the most challenging. And it's honestly the reason I think it's the most challenging is because of missing context. This point about the domain specific knowledge. If I'm trying to decompose a requirement again and I don't understand the entity or the boundary of the thing I'm decomposing to, even if the tool is the best requirements writer in the world, it's probably not going to get that requirement right if it doesn't understand that context information. So I think the only way to understand that really is customization, maybe tailoring or tuning the AI to understand your system to feed it that domain specific knowledge. I don't see another way that it could really understand that. I think AI generating content on its own is the biggest challenge I see.
Maybe go over one more question or comment.
Sure. So next one. Interesting. Okay, so this one about having to upload up to 100 documents with reports and drawings, and you want this to be able to see all this information and compare it to your requirements and highlight non-compliances. Wow, that would be really nice, right? So for it to know when you have maybe a new business or something coming on, could AI quickly help you identify if what you do meets what this new need is? Or then this next point about just uploading one document at a time and asking it to compare to a list. Really, really good point. I think this is a mix of like data analysis and comparing what you do against new needs coming in, which is a huge part of systems engineering and requirements engineering. Let's see what people say about this.
This is Maria. So yes and no. I know that's kind of middle of the road answer, but the problem is, what I have a problem with documents is only as good as the author that wrote it. And the problem is, we all have limitations or gaps in our knowledge, and it's impossible to know everything. So the problem I have is you can't take the human in the loop out. It's impossible. I don't care if you talk about requirements engineering or you're talking about mission planning on the ground for a ground station. You need to have that human in the loop, because if you're going to comply with regulations, if you're going to comply with, I don't know, I'm going to talk here about biotechnology a little bit, being able to comply with biological or scientific laws that state, hey, this is a biomarker that we should be looking at for drug discovery, whatever the case may be. I'm going to give you a cursory overview of those requirements and allow you to write very high level requirements. I guess, again, this is why I said depends. It depends on what you're looking for and the level of granularity you're looking for. Okay, maybe you can do user needs or very high level operational requirements. You're just going to have to drive it anyway. So I don't know. To me, AI is very rudimentary. I don't like to use it at all to do RE, but I know a lot of people out there will argue with me, and that's fine. And especially if you're going to do compliance, boy, is that that is really a complicated use case because with compliance, you have to look at all the regulations, all the policies, everything, and that takes a human person to do. I'm sorry. Maybe AI could help with that, to be able to look at it and give you a high level cursory overview. Fine. It does save some time. But anyway, that's my comments.
A really
Great
great
answer.
comment.
Thanks, Maria. It's good to know that we're going to keep our jobs for the time being then.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody, very much for joining. Really interesting, excellent discussion.
We'll be in the second session. We'll do a PM session, same topic, typically different audience. So we do thank you all for your time and looking forward to more discussions about this. Thank you.
Thanks,
you.
everybody. Very good. Helpful.
Thanks, Sarah.